It's the AFC North Division, and here we are. I'm going solo today talking about the Cleveland Browns. And let me just start by saying this, and I wrote this in my 2022 seasonal previews. The Cleveland Browns are a very complicated team to cover. A lot of moving parts, a lot of disappointment from 2021, a lot of hope for 2022 with the signing of Deshaun Watson, Amari Cooper, and so on. So let's take a look back and a look at the season that went on, and then I will close as usual with what's up next. So, first of all, 2021 didn't go as planned. And we thought that would be the case because the Pythag, the numbers game, said that they didn't deserve their 2020 record. They were more like an 8-9 type team, and 2021 didn't go that well. So we start 2022 with an off season that sees them grab Amari Cooper at a very reasonable wide receiver price. It got worse for other teams when they had to go out and get wide receivers. But in this particular case, Cooper came relatively cheap, and he came right away to be their number one wide receiver. And then the splash Deshaun Watson trade, very controversial, both because of his on-field and off-field stuff. You're talking about a guaranteed contract, one of the largest guaranteed contract, I believe, fully guaranteed contract that the NFL has ever given out. And then, of course, Watson, who missed 2021, would miss the first 11 games of 2022. So it was up to Cleveland at this particular time to then go ahead and say, okay, what can we do to tread water, to do a little bit where we could be in contention for playoff status by the time Deshaun Watson comes back? Can Brissett, the quarterback, be that guy who can get them to 6-5 or maybe even to 5-6? What really were realistic goals for 2022? Well, step back to the draft, and I think one of the things Cleveland did poorly in that draft of 2022 is they sat on the fence. As I said, and I've covered 42 NFL drafts, this was the deepest draft. I'm not saying it was the greatest first round ever. I'm just saying it's the deepest draft from top to bottom that I have ever covered. I had more players rated with draft eligible grades than any other time. And there were some really prime second and third round draft choices that could have been had. What Cleveland did, and they didn't have a pick in the first round, of course, because of Deshaun Watson. They had the 44th pick in the draft. They traded down once or twice. They ended up making their first selection at pick 68. That's just too late. That's 24 picks wasted. And if that wasn't enough, when they started the day out, day 3, pick 118 became pick 156. They traded that pick back 38 spots. I thought Cleveland was too passive on draft day. They didn't get enough hits. They didn't help their roster enough for 2022, knowing that they would not be at full strength in the first 11 games. So let's look at my seasonal keys for last year. And I thought they were relevant keys, and their season came down to either meeting or not meeting these keys. And unfortunately, it went south. We start with the seasonal key number 1, fixing the run defense. They started off strong in 2021, but in their last 9 games in 2021, they allowed over 140 yards per game on the ground. That's not a recipe for success. They had to fix that. Cleveland's had a fairly deep roster over the years, even though it wasn't a great draft for them in 2022. They have a lot of talent, especially at running back, especially at linebacker. There's a lot of talent on this team. It just needed to be harnessed. That was the first key, fixing the run defense. You got to get off the field so that Brissett will have some time to get things figured out. Second key, performance in the second of back-to-back road games. And this is tricky because you start with a Miami game, for example, and then they would have to go to Buffalo the very next week on the road with Brissett at quarterback, a lot of moving parts, like we said, and so on. Then the next time around, they have to go to Houston, that first game with Deshaun Watson back. all that emotion. And then the very next week, they have to go to what was expected to be a very decent Cincinnati team. Maybe not picked to win the division title, maybe yes, but their season win total was higher than Cleveland's. And going there after that emotional game at Houston was not going to be easy. And they had a third set of back-to-back road games at the end of the year, and you just hope that they were still going to be in the race at that time. Going to Washington, you don't want to overlook Washington because your final game on the road right after that is Pittsburgh, and you know those are always physical games. So right away, if they look past any of those first opponents, that's not good. And then with the emotion and the back-to-back and so on, I was very worried about their performance and the way the schedule laid out in back-to-back road games 3 times for 2022. And the final key was just rookie kicker Cade York. You expect Cleveland to be in a lot of close games, especially early on in the season with a new quarterback, new number 1 wide receiver, and so on. We saw what happened in Cincinnati in 2021. They drafted a rookie kicker, and he kicked them all the way to the Super Bowl. I mean, he had some amazing kicks in the playoffs. Cade York, hopefully for Cleveland's sake, was going to be on that same path where he would be the one to win games as opposed to a liability in the close games that we all expected Cleveland to be involved in. So going into the season, we had various different times where Cleveland didn't even have a season win total on them. Then they had an 8. Some places had a 9. It was kind of all over the place. And I preferred at this particular time, with a relatively deep roster, a tricky schedule, and wasn't really sure about what was going on in Pittsburgh. Obviously, Big Ben wasn't there anymore. And I did expect Baltimore to be good, and I expected Cincinnati to stumble at the beginning. And maybe after they got through their primetime games, they would be better. But I just didn't know where to place Cleveland. So I made no decisions, and I wanted to see just how the season would play out. Now, the good news, in terms of at least the expected good news, and I've got their schedule right here. Games 1 to 4 were not perceived to be all that difficult. At Carolina, non-playoff team, hosting the New York Jets, who were expected to be worse, expected to have a bad year. In fact, if you remember that game, the Jets had it all but Cleveland had it all but won. It was 30-17 with only a handful of minutes to go. And Cleveland ended up blowing that game, 99% chance that they were going to win that game, and they didn't win the game. So they had Carolina and the Jets. Then they were home to Pittsburgh with their new quarterback situation. Would it be Trubisky? Would it be Pickett? And so on. And as it turned out, they got an added bonus. Unfortunately, TJ Watt, of course, missed the game. He was injured and out for several weeks. And then they would play at Atlanta, another team still in rebuilding mode with Marcus Mariota and the rookie Desmond Ridder battling out to be who would be the quarterback. A very vanilla offense almost throughout the year. Those 4 games were all winnable, especially the toughest opponent might have been Pittsburgh, but that was a home game. Realistically, they should have been at least 2-2, if not 3-1, if they were going to make any noise. And then in week 5 and 6, they stay home to face the Chargers. As it turns out, Justin Herbert, pretty banged up, but still a very good Charger team. And then home to New England, obviously a fundamentally sound team, but not an exceptional team. New England certainly was not among the elite this year. And instead, what we got was a disappointing 2-5 start. They lose that Jet game in spectacular fashion. They actually start 2-1 because they do beat Pittsburgh, but then they lose to Atlanta, they lose to the Chargers, they lose to New England. They're 2-5, and the season is starting to slip away from them. The stat sheet says we'll go back over in a couple of minutes. Showed that they hadn't made progress in several of the key areas that I was looking to see whether they would make progress. They didn't rally enough around Brissett. The defense really let them down. It should have played better based on their overall personnel. And instead, by the time Deshaun Watson takes over, Cleveland is 4-7. Baltimore's ahead of them, well ahead of them. Cincinnati has already taken some strides ahead of them. A lot of teams, Miami was playing well at the time. New England had a game in hand. Remember, they beat Cleveland, so they would win any tiebreakers in that scenario. Chargers and Kansas City. Playoff hopes were pretty much all but doomed at that particular point. So it didn't look good. And as we found out when Watson came back, even though they had that emotional win against Houston, week 12, his very first game, he looked very, very rusty in that particular game. And in fact, the offense looked even worse. The offensive line couldn't protect him. He just needed game tape. He hadn't played in one full year plus 11 games. So you're talking about a year and 2/3 that Watson was on the sidelines. And it showed the chemistry, the lack of chemistry showed. And in the end, it's basically right here, as you see on the scroll, more questions than answers at the end of the season. They didn't end on a high note. They didn't necessarily end at rock bottom because they won their last game. But a lot of things they have to figure out. Maybe they had too high of an expectation that Deshaun Watson was going to hit the ground running, and he didn't hit the ground running. And it just fell apart. And there were obviously going to be roster and coaching decisions at the end of the year. Now, even though I stayed on the sidelines, I'm very proud of the way I adjusted and pivoted during the year. TJ Watt, we mentioned, was out. I took advantage of that, able to take Cleveland in that particular spot. Pittsburgh's offense wasn't rolling at that time, and they hadn't even won a game. They would lose several games without TJ Watt before they'd ever win one. Big difference for Pittsburgh, as we'll see when I do that particular exit report. Atlanta was a home dog. Atlanta was a fundamentally sound team that also didn't have a lot of pizzazz, but you can't make them a home dog to a Cleveland team who had no rhythm. That was a good one for me. Every one of their second of the back-to-back road games, that didn't work out for them at all. They had a massive pluses when they played on Halloween against Cincinnati, and I did take advantage of that. So I felt very good about what I was doing with them. And with Watson, I went 4-0 when Watson was in the lineup the last 5 games. So I really felt that I had a good pulse week to week on where Cleveland is, even though at the beginning of the year, I just didn't know. I needed to see 2-3 games to see how it would play out. And even at the end of the year, I still have more questions. I clearly am not ready to form an opinion for next year just based on what I saw this particular year. So recapping 2022, just real quickly again, let's just look at Deshaun Watson, 58%, which is not his career arc. His career arc is 67%. His career arc is throwing a lot of touchdowns, not having 7 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. And certainly in his 6 games played, and they didn't throw the ball a lot. They kind of eased him in because remember, they have Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, so they don't have to ease him in. They have a really good running attack that could help balance him out. But still, 6 games played, 20 defensive sacks taken. So there is work to be done as far as where Cleveland is as we sit now. It's February 9th. Yeah, here's my kind of final thoughts as far as where are they. First of all, I still think they have a deeper roster than most. They just have to mold it. They have to get better coaching. They've hired Jim Schwartz. I think what you'll see first and foremost, if you look back at Jim Schwartz's resume, they're going to be tougher against the run. Now, it is a pass-centric league, but you have to get off the field. I talked about those 3 keys, and one of the keys was fixing their run defense. That did not get fixed. Let's face it, they were still allowing 140, 145, 4.8 per carry is what they ended the season defensively. Jim Schwartz will fix that, so that's a positive. That's what I think is next. Watson will be acclimated. He'll have more time with Cooper. Maybe they upgrade the roster a little bit. Maybe Peoples-Jones, who's a pretty good wide receiver, maybe he stays healthy and he has a lot of reps with Watson. Nick Chubb's not going anywhere. So there's a really, really good chance if they elevate their offensive line a little bit more that you're going to see a more fluid offense. So these are good things for Cleveland. They have to address the run D. Remember, they still have to address the run D. And the bottom line is I don't want to be too optimistic about them because the division's going to get tighter. Pittsburgh, I think, is on an arc upward. They had their transition without Big Ben. They're on an arc upward. Baltimore, when all parts are functioning, is still one of the top teams in the AFC. And Cincinnati's not going anywhere. Joe Burrow and a bunch of people on rookie contracts. So they have a lot of work to do, Cleveland, in order to make sure that some of the things that I like about them actually translates to success on the field. So we've got the draft coming up, and picks in the first round and the third round. They're in Houston right now because of the trade for Deshaun Watson. They lose pick 13. They lose pick 73. They do have a minority hiring pick, extra pick, a compensatory pick at the end of the third round. So they will basically go in with pick 42 and a pick near, let's say, 95 to 100. So they'll have 2 picks there. They need to use them wisely. I don't want to see them as passive as they were in the last draft sequence. They need to plug holes right away. They need to get somebody in free agency to supplement the offensive and defensive lines. Those are the 2 areas that I would work on if I were the Cleveland Browns. I want to thank you so much for listening to that. If you want to go ahead and write any comments down on the YouTube videos, I will be sure to check back. Any feedback? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? This is just one of 32 teams that I'm covering in the NFL Exit Report series. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. There's going to be lots of stuff on it, either that I originate or that I bring over from other shows that I'm doing with other people. The NFL doesn't sleep. Even though the games are going to be over in a couple of days, there's still homework to be done. Next up for me will be the final team that I do in the AFC. I'm saving the 2 Super Bowl participants for later, but I will be doing the Pittsburgh Steelers next, and that should be an interesting look back at a transition year for Pittsburgh in a very tough division. This division is going to get tough. Thank you for watching my Cleveland Browns 2022 Exit Report, and I'll see you down the road.